Well, listen, gang, it's 7:01, and this could be full or could be not. I'm not sure, but I thought this was a particularly rich chapter that even the first time I went through it. And I think, well, the same rules as always apply. When you got a question or a comment or an argument, state it therein, and then we'll.
Okay, well, I have a question about the very first sentence.
Okay.
Ooh.
Yeah, I know. Okay, it says that this song offers a stunning embodiment of the reorientation of life most hoped for by evangelical faith.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I need a new definition for evangelical.
Well,
Don't we all?
well, that's the problem. There's an interesting book, The Scandal. Let me see, I'm trying to find it on my shelf up here because I just saw it the other day. But it's something like The Scandal of Evangelicalism. And he talks about, this is written by an evangelical, but he's an educated evangelical. And he rues their lack of intellectual pursuit of the scriptures. And so I guess my answer, and judging from what he's going to say in a text that I'm going to read later, because I know what's going to happen because I'm doing it. But he talks about that there is a central evangelical question, and it does not involve what you and I have come to associate with being evangelical.
Right.
And so stay with me on that, Jane, and then we'll, come back to it if we don't do what we want to do. Okay, this is the Cliff Notes version. For those of you who are, Noble always says he always napped off about halfway into the sermon. So if Noble was here, this was on his behalf. But the focus tonight is on Psalm 77. And what it's about is about a life moved from a preoccupation with self to submission to and reliance upon God. That's the summary.
Right.
If you nap off and there's a question later on the final, you could just say that's what it was. Okay. He divides it up. He divides the text up.
Yeah.
And if you've read it, you know this. He divides Psalm 77 up into 4 parts: 1 through 6, 7 through 9, verse 10, and then 11 through 20. Okay. Now I'll use those divisions because it's his book, and also because I like them and they work for me. Now let's start with verses 1 through 6. I cried out to God for help. I cried out to God to hear me. When I was in distress, I sought the Lord. At night I stretched out untiring hands, and my soul refused to be comforted. I remembered you, O God, and I groaned, I mused, and my spirit grew faint. Selah, by the way, I looked up Selah. It's always bothered me what that word means. They don't know. They're not real clear. They think it's a praise word. Have you ever heard different than that, Kathleen, about what that is?
I've heard yes, first I've heard nobody knows. And a lot of speculation that it has to do with directions for the choir master or the choir.
Okay.
At this point, you do something different in the music, or you stop and it's read and then you sing again, something like that.
But there's not a lot of clarity about it.
No.
Anyway, we go on to 4. You kept my eyes from closing. I was too troubled to speak. I thought about the former days, the years of long ago. I remembered my songs in the night. My heart mused and my spirit inquired. Now, listening to that, reading that, what's the focus of those verses?
I'm in trouble.
Me.
Yeah.
Me. Good call. It's me.
What translation are you using, John?
Well, I'm using the one he used. I'm probably New International and several others.
Oh, okay.
And he uses a different, he says someplace which version he uses, but anyway, go ahead.
Okay. The very frequent use of I, the focus of these verses is me. It reminds me very much of the parable of the Pharisee and the publican, especially the Pharisee. Dear God, I am so glad that I am me. I am so wonderful, I make myself sick. You know, whatever, it goes on and on. It also reminded me of, and this will date me and some of you who might remember it, back when Saturday Night Live had a really good cast as opposed to now. But anyway, when when Al Franken was on, before he became a comedian, became a senator, and then wasn't. And he had a bit one night where he said, this is going to be the Al Franken decade. And this has stuck with me forever, obviously. He said, for the next 10 years, anytime a decision comes up in your life, I want you to ask yourself, how will this benefit me, Al Franken? He said, that's the most important thing to consider, me. And he would always do it the same way. The most important thing to consider is me, Al Franken. And then he came on 10 years later and reprised the bit. I found that on on YouTube the other night. Years ago, a guy named Charles Merrill Smith, not the Charles Merrill that I knew and many of us knew at university, wrote a book called How to Become Bishop Without Being Religious. And,
it was wonderful.
And he talked about, one of the chapters was choosing the appropriate hymns. And he said, you have to remember that people like to sing about themselves. So it's very important that the hymn include a large number of first-person pronouns. So he said, obviously, the most famous hymn for everybody will be, I come to the garden alone. Because he walks with me, and he talks with me, and he tells me I am his own, and the joy we share. He said it's like the first person pronoun shows out 18 times in the first two verses, thus making it the appropriate hymn. And so when I started reading Brueggemann talking about these first 6 verses about the self-centeredness of all those things for good or ill came to mind. And it does seem to me that those 6 verses can serve as kind of being emblematic of the particular time that we're living in for now, with a center on the self and on me. All you have to do is watch any of the YouTube tirades of people going nuts in Walmart because they can't wear a mask or whatever, and it's about me and my rights and my stuff, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. First 6 verses. Now, 7 through 9. Will the Lord reject forever? Will he never show his favor again? Has his unfailing love vanished forever? Has his promise failed for all time? Has God forgotten to be merciful? Has he in anger withheld his compassion? Again, Selah. Now, what we have here is a series of rhetorical questions that seem to relate to God. Notice that he is trying to use all the appropriate religious words. He talks about has got God's unfailing love, or what we've been talking about as Hesed, his steadfast love. In other words, has God's steadfast love vanished forever? Has God forgotten to be merciful, which was Raham, as we talked about last time? He also, just to make it even better, throws in a third one, which is Hanan, Hanan, and that means loyalty, graciousness, or compassion. In other words, has God ceased to be a source of loving kindness, a source of mercy, and a source of compassion? Now, it sounds like he's talking about God, but he's really talking about, why is this even coming up? Because I'm not getting what I want. Okay, Davis, you want, yeah.
Well, it also struck me that he's asking those questions, and because of the first 7 verses, he's asking, why has God ceased to be compassionate to me?
That's
Why
exactly right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Although those statements don't say to me or
Mhm.
right, because we hope God is those things for everybody.
Well, yeah, but we're really more interested. I have found that, if I've got my choice between God being gracious to everybody and God being gracious to me, I'm pretty clear about which one I'm going to opt for.
Right.
The real question he's asking is, why aren't these concepts, Hesed, Raham, and Hanan, why aren't these concepts working for me? Why is this happening to me? Okay. Now, on page 48, Brueggemann writes, the speaker sounds as one who understands how it all works. Now, some of this is just really good. He knows what mobilizes. He says he knows. What he really means is he thinks he knows.
Yeah.
What mobilizes God's Hesed and Raham. She knows how to get it. The crisis of the poem may be one of 2 things. Either the speaker knows how to make it all work, which means everything has been emptied of mystery, or more likely, even though the speaker knows how to make it work, it does not work. It is then a religion that has failed.
For him.
Right. I've been good. How come this is happening? I did my part of the deal. What's happening here? All right, the virus compounded with everything else, like any other hard time, raises hard questions just like this. Especially if, if you live with the American illusion that somehow we're really the chosen people. You can read the Bible about the Jews, but that was just them. That's moved now. God's really on our side. Okay. Then 48 and 49. In our psalm, the speaker is a person of conventional obedience. He has some ground to stand on and some legitimate expectations of Yahweh. He is not a renegade who has forfeited his expectations from God, but the voice of obedience is on the move, driven there by the failure of convention. In other words, a question is being raised. And the question is, why isn't this working? And if it is not working, what do I need to understand in order for it to work, quote unquote? Does that make any sense? Her imagination is beginning to move, beginning to guess that God's Hesed is not unilaterally unconditional and automatically linked to this particular believer. The poem begins to suspect that God's Hesed, if indeed God is faithful, has other worlds to work and cannot be summoned on demand. It reminds me of the people that pray to get a parking space near the front door. That always kind of, and I also wonder, why do we pray before a football game? What do we pray for? But anyway, since I was the one who had to lead the prayer when I was in high school, I live with that anyway. Okay, God is not on call. Now, I think if you're reading along with me, I found several what I thought were typographical errors in the book. I think it was put out quick. And this is one of them. He said, there is a probe. I think he means there is a problem. There is a problem here that the space between the two partners is dangerous and unknown space. All of that space has not yet been reduced and routinized, if that's the way you say that, so that it might be presumed upon. Some of the space between here and God's throne is untamed and therefore unpredictable. And if the space is beyond control, it makes one more frantically press for the old innocent faith that had God encapsulated. In other words, had God nailed down. If I do this, God does that. Okay? With me so far? Okay. He continues, the speaker has grown comfortable with the great affirmations readily translated into self-serving assurance. I have taken the great truths of the faith and I have shaped them around to where they fit who?
Me.
Okay. But now that is all being blown out of the water. A God who has been reduced to the safe proposals, my mouth's not working, proposals of a Torah so righteous, now is known to be a God whose form is not seen, even if that form is thought to consist in Hesed, Hanan, and Raham. In other words, when people start talking about God as mystery, that's what they're talking about. And this is not a new concept. This has been around forever. Anselm, in whatever century it was, said, God is that, then nothing greater can be conceived. Okay. The desperate rhetorical questions appear in verses 7 and 9 after the self-inventory of verse 1 through 6. The speaker begins to guess that the old, sure religion is collapsing. He begins to worry that God is no longer our God, the one we have, this is my thought, the one we have contracted to work for us. We have a parochial view of God, the God who thinks like us, which again draws me back to the great theological insight of Monty Python's Flying Circus from years ago. And this guy he's a priest. It was John Cleese. And has the collar on and everything. And he's reading and he says, as God has said, and quite rightly, I add. In other words, God must be right. Why? Because God agrees with me. Okay. So here's where we are. The first 6 verses can be summarized as me, me, me. 7 to 9 began to ask unsettling questions indicating that the system is not working for me, me, me. And that leads us to verse 10, which is a brutal verse in a lot of ways. Questions so far, comments so far. Okay. Verse 10 is troublesome and apparently rather hard to translate because of the wording itself or because some of the translators just didn't like the way it sounded. By the way, that happens. When there's a question about, that's what translation is, some of you heard me say this time and time again, translation is not a science. Translation is an art form. Because there's so many times when one word in one language does not directly translate into the other language. For example, we do not have a word that really translates for Hesed. We just say loving kindness, but that's as close as we can come. Okay. So sometimes if they've got a choice, and it's not just, but there's 2 or 3 options, and one option more closely fits with their theological bent, guess which one? Well, of course it's this, because that's what obviously it means. Because that's what makes sense to me. Okay.
What I want it to mean. Again, an I thing.
Oh,
right?
sure. Absolutely. Yeah. Let's see. If it's some, okay. Now, just listen to the different translations. I mean, he lists some, and then Noble put me onto another one today. The NIV. This is the easiest one, as near as I can tell. Then I thought, to this I will appeal, the years of the right hand of the Most High. Easy, not a lot of problem. The RSV says, and I say it is my grief that the right hand of the Most High has changed. Okay. The Jerusalem Bible says, this I said then is what distresses me, that the power of the Most High is no longer what it was. The New English Version says, has his right hand, I said, lost its grasp? Does it hang powerless, the arm of the Most High? But then Noble pointed out the message. And the message is just great.
I like it too.
Just my luck, I said. The high God goes out of business just the moment I need him most. I just thought that
The idea that God is a business.
yeah, that's it in a nutshell. You know,
Yeah.
oh, sure. You know, all these other people get God's help, but now I want it and it's gone. You know, it was just worth its weight in gold to me. Now, it's very important, I think, to compare Jonah and this psalm. If you remember the story of Jonah, once we get him out of the whale, you know, forget about all that. He goes to Nineveh, finally, just real thrilled about this prospect. He's been told that he was to let them know that they were in real trouble. So he stands on the edge of the city and whispers, because he really didn't want anybody to hear, and he really wants these people to be, you know, burned at the stake or whatever. And somebody hears him and the whole town converts. And so God forgives them. Okay, Jonah is absolutely furious. I knew you would forgive them, and that's why I didn't want to come. Okay, another loving person living out his faith. But now, compare that with this psalm. And in this psalm, there is a frustration, especially as it's worded in the Message translation. There is this frustration that the graciousness I counted on has not been received like I expected it to be. God will work the way I want God to work, or I don't want any part of God. So what's happened here is, now let's trace. That's what I love about this chapter, this psalm. It's all about me. Me isn't working. Why isn't this working? What's going on here? Now, he is faced with a problem. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. By the way, Jews don't have any problem asking questions of God. Christians do. Maud Gaston, who I told you about last week, Maud Gaston would have been a great Jew. I mean, she'd have been a wonderful Jew because she always had questions. And she was married to Bill Gaston, who once said to me, and he was 80 some odd years old when I talked to him, and I assumed, of course, being young and intellectually adept because I'd been to seminary, that he was an old guy that didn't know anything. And he looked at me and he says, you know, I've always had problems with the concept of hell. And I said, well, why, Bill? And he said, well, he says that's eternal damnation. He said, if it's eternal, where's the rehabilitation in that? And I said, well, there's an interesting question. Okay. So he and Maud were meant for each other, as near as I can tell. Okay, now, Notice that in verse 10, it appears in all the translation, the assumption of the poet is, who has changed? God has changed. There is no inclination or indication of an awareness that perhaps my perception of the relationship between me and God might have been wrong. Okay? Not that hadn't even come up yet. Okay. Apparently, it is much easier to assume that God has changed than to deal with the perception that we might be wrong. And yet, what do we say? God is unchangeable. Well, maybe somebody needs to change at this point. On page 50, the sure comfort of an utterly obedient relationship. By the way, that raises that line, if you found it, that raises the question as to who is obedient to whom. Are we obedient to God, or is God being obedient to us because we have learned to say the right words, which makes God act? So, okay. It's shattered by the awareness that this hidden free God will not be fully discerned or completely predictable. And the response must be to break out of obedience of a simple kind for the practice of an imagination that seeks to find other ways of relating to this free God. To relate to such a free God requires freedom on the part of the believer, a freedom likely censored by the conventional religion of verse 1 through 6. Or, by the way, of Job's friends in that story. Well, we know what happened. Well, what happened? Well, you must have done something wrong. Well, how do we know I did something wrong? Well, because all this stuff is happening to you. And that's the way the system works. Okay? Because of that, faith can often, as he says, thus faith can often not only run counter to our culture, but sometimes our religion. There is a difference sometimes, by the way, between faith and religion. Are we clear on what that difference is? Religion is the stuff we put together to how it works and, that kind of stuff. Verse 10 is scary for us, and it offers several possibilities for understanding. Again, page 50. If one is linked to a flat one-dimensional faith, this is a bitter loss of faith. But if we think in terms of obedience on its way, by the way, remember that one of the possible translations for the creation, the first verses of the creation story is when God began creating. Like it's an ongoing process. It's not when God created. It's when God began creating. I put that in. It will not be on the final, but it's there. Okay. If we think in terms of obedience on its way to risky imagination, then this verse is an opening for new faith beyond the conventions and routines that secure but do not reckon with God's awfulness. Now, please look carefully at the way that word is spelled. It is not AWFULNESS, meaning God is awful, terrible, nasty, wicked, mean, and dirty. It's awfulness, AWEFULNESS. God is full of, God inspires awe. The presence of God makes us full of awe when we are fully aware of that existence. This verse stands at a very risky and dangerous place. Now, here we go, Jane, hang on.
I see it.
Where evangelical faith often stands, and indeed it must stand. And as we stand there, we never know in advance if we face loss of faith or opening for new faith. The problem is that one branch, Jane, of evangelicalism has frozen. But they ain't a cult of one, by the way. you know, I mean, they're not the only ones that got a lock on that kind of stuff. But I mean, but that's what's happened. And so evangelicalism is really a much broader term than we have allowed it to become, I think. So again, we never know in advance if we face loss of faith or opening for new faith. The dramatic substance of verse 10 leaves the issue quite unresolved, and we must not rush past that dramatic moment in the speech pilgrimage. In other words, we really don't like to be in that kind of position. We're going to go one way or the other, quick, hopefully without as much thought as possible. Okay. 51. We do not know how any faith speaker makes the leap from preoccupation with self to an imaginative acknowledgement of the primacy of the other. But this is what happens in this psalm and in all serious biblical faith. It involves leaving the safety of the Torah so righteous for the God so near, who is yet so free. The dramatic move concerns the abandonment of self as the primal agenda for the thou who is out beyond us in freedom. And we make no mistake to observe that the transfer of the agenda, that ceding of concern for self to the other, ceding of concern for self to the other is the crucial move of biblical faith, the sine qua non for covenanting. And we observe what an urgent, difficult task Christian nurture and preaching now is. For the narcissism of our culture is precisely aimed at not ceding self, not relinquishing. This psalm models the very move of faith that our culture wants to prevent. The whole consumer perspective concerns retention of self and satiation of self. That is what is given in verse 1 through 6 and what is relinquished in what follows. Mm-hmm. The religious temptation among us is to walk close to the dangerous rhetorical questions of 7 to 9, to become aware of the hurt and anguish of 10, but then to circle back to 1 to 6, which permits a preoccupation with self and the self's program and requires a numbing, because being numb will do if there is no deliverance. I'm still trying to make sense out of that sentence, to be honest with you. By the way, the prosperity gospel strikes me as just that kind of move. God wants me to be rich. Now, there are stages of faith that one may or may not progress through. To move from one stage to the other is not always joyful, but can be a fearful, often painful thing to you and to those around you when you raise unsettling questions. And by the way, that's the best use of that word, because you are questioning that which people want to hold as settled. I remember asking, I was in seminary and I was working at Lexington, First Methodist Church, Lexington, North Carolina. Pastor was Mitch Faulkner. He's a great guy. And I was comfortable asking him questions, and I raised several theological questions with him, and he basically paled. He just didn't want to talk about it because it unsettled too much. Okay, I want to read 52 just because there's one sentence in there that I absolutely love. That one of several possibilities concerns us directly as we seek to be faithful and as we seek to live in our culture. On the one hand, that move is a move from a religion of law to a religion of grace. And then here's the sentence. It articulates the awareness that we live by gift and not by grasp.
Oh.
We live by gift and not by grasp. I mean, that's That's tough. Okay. On the other hand, observe that in our society of consumer narcissism, a religion of petty, moralistic obedience goes with an economics of satiation. That is, in our secularized version of it, we do not hope for God to satisfy all our desires, but we do expect to have all our desires satisfied, even if by another source. So we are part of a culture that holds together consumer satiation and petty obedience. That tight alliance serves to keep us as the agenda, an excuse for not seeing life beyond self, an inability to transfer attention beyond our needs and our appetites. Are you still with me so far? Is that you hear where he's going? It's all right to say you don't. We can talk about it because it's tough stuff.
Excuse me.
Go.
I think it's the petty obedience that I don't quite understand when we're talking about today's society. What does he mean by that in today's culture?
Well, I think it is, for example, if I can think, and I have to go back. See, I have an advantage here because I was raised by Arkansas Baptists. I know what petty obedience looks like. There was a list of things you did not do. Drink, smoke, chew, run around with girls that do, you know, that kind of stuff. I would expand it now to say that's part of the problem that some people have with gay rights, is because a part of their obedience assumes the value of straightness. And so they are, and it's hard to, okay, this is harsher than probably, but there is a petty obedience to my straightness. I value it because it gives me some kind of control. And my assumption is that if I do the steps, if I give 10%, if I don't smoke, if I don't drink, or what if I don't. And it's often don'ts, by the way. If I don't, then I get. Which raises a question that may come up later, and it's almost infantile, because what are we doing? We're going, if I don't do this, what do I get? I mean, yeah, Davis. You have something?
Yeah, can't any group or culture or create their list of don'ts?
Oh, they do.
Yeah,
they
right.
all do.
So we probably do thinking they're great lists of don'ts. And
yeah, but the difference is
to join them.
The difference is the assumption that my list of don'ts is somehow obligating God. You understand what I'm saying? In other words, I have come up with my list of good stuff, which obviously I think is good because I do it, and it makes it easier. As I've told several of you, I have never seen a religion yet that said everybody's going to heaven but us. It doesn't happen. Okay. Here's my stuff. Okay, now my stuff obligates God, because if I do my stuff, then God has to reward me. What do I get for being good? And you're right. We all come up with it, but then we make that next step, which is to say, if I do what I think I'm supposed to do, then that obligates God to come through for me.
And again, that petty obedience is all about me.
Oh, yes. Sure.
It's not about what God is like. It's all about me.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. John Newell has a quote I found. It was online the other day. This is from his article, The Rebirthing of God. Said, when we truly shine and when we work for the true shining of every child, woman, man, and creature, we find that sometimes we create discomfort in the people around us and in the holders of power in our communities and in our world. because my obedience is somewhat petty, hard as that is to believe. Okay.
John,
Yeah, go.
part of the lesson of the pandemic is that even if you have the right list and you're being utterly obedient, that doesn't get you where you think you ought to be. It doesn't obligate God to do anything.
Well, yes. Well, I think you're absolutely right. That's the shattering thing. I mean, that's basically what this chapter is about. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm hurting. First 6 verses. I'm hurting. How come am I hurting, God? Because, aren't you supposed to be faithful? Aren't you supposed to be merciful? Aren't you supposed to be caring?
Yeah.
Okay.
But part of what is interesting to me, and I'm missing the point somewhere,
No.
this is in the Old Testament. And to me, I always thought the Old Testament was all about the covenantal relationship with God. And
It
this
is.
covenant, right, between us and you, God, right? We have this deal that we have a covenant.
No. See, that's what that was the problem with the book of Job.
Yeah.
Okay. The first half of the Old Testament is basically that. And then all of a sudden you've got this thing just drop out of nowhere that says, no, maybe you ought to rethink this thing. Because Job was good. What's that? I'm trying to remember who said it. There are 3 things you can say. God is just. God is merciful. Job was a good man. 2 of those things can be true. Not all 3 of them. And so it raised the question. And where he's going to go, unless we can stay with it just a second, he said, now we look at what we are, we are covenanting with. What is the nature of the person that we're covenanting with? And it does not have to do necessarily with my situation. It has to do necessarily with the relationship we have with the one who is at the center of things. And it calls for a broader, a much more expanded idea of God. And stay with me, Pete, and then if it doesn't help, we'll come back to this, okay? In 11 through 20, I will remember the deeds of the Lord. I will remember your miracles of long ago. I will meditate on all your works and consider all your mighty deeds. Your ways, O God, are holy. What God is so great is our God. You are the God who performs miracles. You display your power among the peoples. With your mighty arm, you redeemed your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. The waters saw you, O God. The waters saw you and writhed. The very depths were convulsed. The clouds poured down water. The skies resounded with thunder. Your arrows flashed back and forth. Your thunder was heard in the whirlwind. Your lightning lit up the world. The earth trembled and quaked. Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters, though your footprints were not seen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. Now, in those, 9 verses, what do you notice there? Who's the subject there?
All about God.
It's all about God. I is mentioned twice. First 2 verses, or first verse. I will what? Remember. I will be aware. I will remember your miracles of long ago. I remember how you have acted. That there is more at stake here than me. Yeah.
I also noticed that instead of me, it's talking about what God has done for the people, like everybody.
Yeah,
there's
absolutely.
a community aspect to it also.
Yeah, exactly.
More inclusive.
Brueggemann wants to make this point. He said the move from verse 1 to 10 to verse 11 is like the move, this gets to the New Testament, Pete, you were worried about, is like the move envisioned by Jesus in Mark 8:35. For whoever would save his life would lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake in the Gospels will save it. The first part with this series of I is about keeping life. The move to the second part with the series of thou is a readiness to lose life in order to gain it in terms of this one who is merciful to all. Now, he goes on to talk about the place of prayer and liturgy. He says on 53, I do not suggest that prayer and liturgy are the full scope of self-surrender. And by the way, an aside, it's my understanding, and I have not researched this thoroughly, so I could be corrected, that German church liturgy in the 20s and 30s opened the way for Hitler, because it began to talk about, we are receiving communion today from the rich German earth.
Nice.
European settlers used theology to justify the eviction and genocide of Native Americans. I'm reading Howard Zinn's book, The History of America, or The People's History of America, or something like that. And I'm just through the first two chapters, and the first one was the way Columbus and the others dealt with the Indians. And then today's chapter was on the slave trade. And there ain't nothing pretty about that. And yet, it was justified religiously. Why? Because I needed it to be justified religiously. It was about me. It was not about a God who was merciful and loving and compassionate. Okay. I'm very sure that unless there are liturgic ways for the move in our lives, we will not make them elsewhere. You know, a lot of times we go to church, and I planned enough worship services for all time. And we have all these prayers we pray and everything. And most of the time we go through them absolutely brain dead. If you really want to have fun, change the tempo to the Lord's Prayer and watch what happens. People don't know where they are. Anyway, I slowed it down one time. People went nuts. But anyway, if you worship, liturgy sets us up to a new imagination, to see things we would not see. It can also hinder our development, depending on how we use it, okay? The very rhetoric, he says in the middle, the very rhetoric of Israel here makes such a move thinkable, i.e. capable of being imagined. By verse 11, the speaker has abandoned the preoccupation with self and is able to focus on this one who has, quote, changed, unquote. The same change that caused resentment and loss in verse 10. He started to think, well, wait, there may be more to this than just me and God. Who was it, you and me? Oh, it was Bill Cosby's Noah. When it starts raining, he said, Noah's in the middle of his rant about people are laughing at me, and have you looked in the bottom of that boat, and who's going to clean up all that mess? And he said, it started to rain. That's a lot of rain. He said, oh, you and me, Lord, all the way. Huh. So, I wish Cosby hadn't done that. He was such a great sermon source for so long. Yes. And now I can't use him anymore. Page 53, by verse 11, the speaker's on his way to a new model, a new world of imagination. In 1 through 6, the speaker has focused narrowly on my present, which is all consuming. Now there is a re-entry into our past, which has been bracketed out by our self-occupation. I forgot all that stuff. Why? I was so concerned about me right now. I'm looking like a key point is made. I'm on 54. A key point is made in verse 13. Thy way, O God, is holy. God's way is holy other. We need to talk more about God as mystery. We're a group of people that wants to understand and know, I want to be clear. Well, there's some things you're not going to understand. And right now, between it's God for me and cell phones, I don't understand either one of those, how they work. I mean, I don't know. Okay. Not to be over my needs found. And then it goes on to say, what God is great like our God? No God like ours. No God so near. No God so free. No God so surprising or exasperating. God, I wish he would listen to me. Here is the end to all analogy. In other words, we can't say God is like, because there's nothing God is like. God is beyond, whatever. And the bold liberated speaker of verse 11 through 20 discovers that the self-preoccupied speaker of verse 1 through 6 was complaining about an idol. For this free God of Hesed, Hanan, and Raham, loving kindness, compassion, grace, kindness, and mercy, will not be treated like a fortune cookie.
Man.
Note that nothing mentioned in 1 through 6 has been resolved. In other words, nothing's been fixed. What has happened? Now everything has been recontextualized. The speaker in verse 1 through 6 is preoccupied because he is in a narrow range in which such personal trouble requires a conclusion that God does not care. I am not fixed, thus there is no God. That narrow religious agenda is, however, shattered by awareness of God's incomparability, by reference to God's concrete history, but most of all, is shattered by the utterance, thou. Why this is important. All of us struggle to stay home with the sure company of I. We move between a petty religion of calculating obedience aimed at well-being, and I'm adding, what do I get for being good, which is a childish question, which raises the other question, what's the real difference between Jesus and Santa Claus? But that's another sermon. And a fully liberated, imaginative religion of awe and amazement and trembling before the Holy One. We are faced with a moment of deciding to live in the world where the Most High changes or our perceptions are inaccurate, or to retreat back into a world where the least high keeps us at the center of things. God is not dead, but we have seen the limits of the God that we have created. And it goes back to that quote that he had right at the first of the book of Tennyson. Our little systems have their day. Now, does that do you any good at all, Pete? You're dead. I think you're muted.
You might like it better that way.
Well, I don't know. Noble is always telling me, he said, God, I wish we'd have had that mute on Sunday morning. But anyway, go.
I'm just playing devil's advocate, which is probably not the best thing to do in a Bible study group. So if I've lost a loved one to COVID, that died from it, I don't have a job. I don't have prospects of a job. I'm going to have trouble paying my rent. I understand that God is great. What is that? What do I do? What is this understanding of God, that he's awful, full of that, he inspires awe? What does that do for me in that instance?
Well, it doesn't fix anything.
That's for sure.
Okay. Now but if I understand Brueggemann right, what it does do is recontextualize the situation. In other words, it is still God's world. Now, this may not seem like that it fits, but people used to ask me about what do I think about life after death? And my answer was, if I can trust God with my life, I can trust God with my death. Now, I think the issue is here, can I trust God with my life? Not necessarily, can I trust God to make my life better? Can I trust God with my life? And can I trust that God is ultimately gracious? And that doesn't sell as well.
Could I try?
Go ahead, Kathleen.
Could I try something about covenant, since
Go for it.
that's what Pete mentioned? The covenant with Abraham, was before the giving of the law and all that. And I think what it was all about was, I will be your God and you will be my people. And it's about relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And so, when you lose everything, you can do what John mentioned earlier, which is, yell at God and argue with God. But in the end, where are you going to go?
Yeah.
Whom have I on earth beside thee? Whom in heaven but thee? And so, that's an immense leap of faith. And I've never lost everything. So I don't know. If I could do that. But
Well, he talked about that some last week in the last week's stuff, that the place of prayer is not laundry listing, but the place of prayer is covenant building, is relationship building, is trying to understand the nature of God and your relationship with that particular reality, however that you can come to grips with that. And to use Brueggemann's term, it doesn't change anything. It just recontextualizes it. You have a different place to stand. Not a great example, but some analogy. If you're that person that you just talked about, or, lost your job, lost your family, whatever. If you have to face that by yourself, it's different than having to face that same set of circumstances with somebody you love.
Always.
Yeah, see, so you're not alone. It's that deal. And if the relationship is intact or has been built up, then you have something to fall back on. And that's why this 10th verse is so damn scary, because we're much more comfortable in 1 through 6 than we are with 11 through 9, whatever.
John,
Yeah.
I would say to Pete, I agree. It doesn't just to sit there and say, well, God's great, God's wonderful. Yeah. It's that God, I've got to trust that God is in relationship with me, and that therefore when I'm suffering and all the things that you're talking about, that God is there suffering with me. I mean, I always have found that as comforting in my worst times. But I agree, just saying, oh, God's great, that just sounds like, well, God's a great guy, but he doesn't care about me. It's the caring about me part that is important. And it's not just, I don't think that's saying it's about me. I think that's saying about God. Something about God, that God is there for me, with me, even at my worst times. And but I agree, just saying, well, God, you're the greatest, that doesn't
No, I agree. What, Pete, you start to say something?
Well, that's where I get to, I guess, intellectually as well. And that's what I've always been taught, is that God is with you. And that's the benefit, the lesson of the incarnation. But if I was having all those troubles and my life was, I've lost everything, or seeming to have lost everything, and God is with me, it sure would be tempting to say, God, if you're really with me,
Yeah.
a
break wouldn't hurt,
And not just me. There's a lot of people like me who could use the help as well.
Oh, sure. No question.
I am wondering, I'm feeling like that those 10th and 11th verses, that point where things change, and a line that was on page 53 about God's people who are always trapped or in journey between this I-centered and thou-centered place, that is where we all are, somewhere on that spectrum, right? And and right now, or someone facing all the possible loss that could be happening right now, maybe further to one direction on that spectrum right now. That's I don't know.
Yeah. And I think you're right. I don't think that it's a straight line. Every day, every way, we're getting better and better. It's, what we said. Well, gang, it is after 8, and I appreciate it. Let's do it again Thursday, shall we say, and we'll do the last couple of chapters and wrap this thing up. And have a good week. Take care of each other. Put on a mask.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. That was a great chapter.
Be good.
Thank you.
Enjoy Hamilton. Yeah.
Yeah.
Where's my leave button?